Well, yesterday marked a turning point in the battle to reopen the American economy. Last night, the president put out these guidelines, which I haven't exactly gone over in excruciating detail, and I don't really feel the need to, but they essentially laid out some broad qualifications that a state should meet before reopening its economy. And it was meant to be put out there to be used to, better inform state governors on what they're doing. And it was a soft way for Trump to tell a bunch of states that already meet these guidelines that, hey, you should be a little less stringent on your people. You should loosen the grip of your police state. And I have to say that this was a much smarter strategy, I think, than what he was talking about a little bit earlier in the week. And not surprising, because Trump tends to be a bit of an impulsive person. He was outraged and saying how he has the ultimate authority to tell the governors what to do, and they need to do as he says, and all this stuff, and started sounding like a dictator. Which, ironically, he wanted to use dictatorial powers to give people back their freedom, which not a lot of people point out. Most dictators seize power to take away freedom from individual people. But anyway, that's beside the point. Here, he was able to do this in such a way to where he was promoting the opening of these states without actually doing it himself, and looking like a dictator, whose authority would be challenged in the court and ultimately struck down. But also, he was able to do it without actually making himself responsible for the results of reopening these states, because all he did was put out guidelines. He is not the one making the call on when to reopen things. And so if the governors, keep things closed too long, it will be their fault, because Trump put out these guidelines saying, hey, you probably should have reopened, but it's not my right to tell you what to do, and because of the Constitution. So it's not my fault, Trump could say. However, if they open too early, which perhaps Trump might have done if he had his will, or if he had his way, he might have just decided to open up all these states. If that happens and people start getting sick again and there's a big problem, the governor is still the one at fault, because ultimately it was their call. Ironically, the first governor to take the bait this morning and actually talk about, hey, maybe it's time to set a timetable for when we can ease this lockdown, was the Praetorian governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer. For those of you who are unfamiliar, she's essentially a whiter version of Kamala Harris, a cop through and through, a natural-born nag who thinks that she needs to play everybody's mom on TV. In her state, she's imposed restrictions on the freedom of movement that are so severe that people apparently are being arrested for just, going outside of their own home and even being on their own property. That is, of course, unless they are doing some sort of state-mandated essential function. And of course, this is true to a great extent in many states across the U.S., most of them at this point. The difference being that each governor is able to play with this whole regime that we're currently in by broadening or narrowing the definition of essential, activities and services. I've talked about in the past how the governor here in Florida, Ron DeSantis, did not want to lock down the state and did not want to deprive people of their freedom of movement and all that, and he was dragged through the mud in the national press, talking about how he's responsible for people dying and things, and how irresponsible he is as a governor and all these things. So finally, he snapped, and he said, okay, we're locking everything down, and I got real scared. But then, what he essentially did, after issuing this stay-at-home order, was define most things that were still up and running at that point as being essential. And so before the lockdown was issued here, we had already had restaurants and things shut down, no major gatherings and sporting events and all that. Everywhere that, would be a real big red flag to spreading this virus, that was already shut down. And so here, non-essential essentially means any job where you're not, actively endangering other people, because you're not in a cubicle right next to them, or because, you're not indoors in direct contact with people. And so, all the service providers and things, roofers and electricians and plumbers and pest control guys and all these sorts of businesses are still able to operate. And of course, we as individuals are free to go about our business, leaving our homes and doing what we want. We're just, strongly advised to stay home. And pretty much everyone is, because people are scared. So you don't need to, use these overzealous, tyrannical police to go and bash people's heads in Macron style. It's only these people who are mad with power like Gretchen Whitmer who believe much more in authority than in safety, and certainly, have no predisposition towards liberty. They define essential services and essential activities in a very narrow sense. And so a lockdown in Michigan looks very different than a lockdown in Florida, at least from what I understand. And so, I look at that, and I think that, across the country, this must also be true, that there's a very broad spectrum of how locked down the country is. And so that brings me to Gretchen Whitmer's actual announcement. Her announcement was not that, hey, everyone's going to be free to go back to work here soon. What she said was that in a couple of weeks, starting on May 1st, they're thinking of, opening up some activities that were deemed non-essential before, and broadening essentially that definition of essential services. So it's not that Michigan is going to go back to work and be like everything was before this whole lockdown started. No, Michigan probably will just start to look more like a state like Florida or other states that aren't quite as strict in their lockdown, but things are not going away. And so, this woman seems to have been moved on her position. But she's not coming off of it. She's just being, like I said, less tyrannical about it. You can kind of compare it to Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping didn't, abolish, the oppressive regime that Mao founded in China. What he did was he changed it, he altered it, he opened it up a little bit to make it work a little bit better. But, Chinese people even today are very far from, what we would call free. And so that's how I would describe the prospects for our, friends and family who may live in the damned state of Michigan. Something that gave me a bit of a tinge of joy this morning, though, was seeing the president's reaction on Twitter. He tweeted two very simple words in all caps, "Liberate Michigan," which I like that language, talking about how these states that are under lockdown have to be liberated from their governors. It's a very good anti-government message. Now, of course, everyone who's been listening to this channel for any decent period of time knows that since January I've been very concerned with this virus. I've thought that it is a very bad thing, and I certainly don't want to catch it. I don't want to spread it to any of my family, and I do think it is a very big threat. However, this is very different than thinking that I want to live in some kind of a police state. And folks on cable news and on Twitter have, of course, politicized this whole terrible tragedy to the greatest extent possible, to the point to where, hey, if you oppose living in a police state, well, then you're just, a Republican science denier who doesn't think the virus is a problem. Because if you don't want the police to bash you over the head with a billy club, or, well, actually, that's something that only really happens in Europe. In America, you're much more likely to be shot if you disobey the police. If you don't want that, and you don't think that that's a great idea, well, then you just want people to get sick. You don't think anyone should stay home because, without the threat of murder, nobody's going to stay home. And, I really have trouble taking that from people who, even specific people within my, recent memory, were denying the severity of this virus and saying that it was racist to be worried about it. The Canadian government was going with that line for a little while. There were op-eds written in, left-wing newspapers by people of Asian descent saying how they felt so uncomfortable going in public because people were afraid of them. It really is disgusting how quick people can turn and act like they've, like they never held their past positions and like they've always held the current one that they have, and how disgusted they are if you, at all question it, let alone disagree. Because, again, I don't disagree that the virus is a very bad problem. I disagree with these disgusting tyrants who want to use that as an excuse to put you under their boots. One positive takeaway from all this, I think, is that people are rightfully alarmed by the government's response to all of this, or at least the government's very belated response. The government responded in January or February. I think that the government had an opportunity to respond quite positively, but they chose not to. They chose to obfuscate, and now they've responded very negatively by cracking down on the people rather than cracking down on the virus. And so if nothing else, this virus has reminded a whole new generation of Americans and given them a very direct evidence that the Second Amendment is very necessary, and that guarding against government tyranny is something that we actually have to worry about. The tyranny is very possible, and now it's something that we've all seen. Sure, in this case it was, justified to a certain extent by this terrible crisis, but it proves that this sort of thing can happen on American soil, that we can be subjected to a police state. And so in the future, those of us who are, of course, great advocates of the Second Amendment simply for the reason of guarding against government tyranny, none of this, self-defense crap that the NRA and FUDs like to push, we will be able to point to this time in our history and say, hey, what are you going to do when this happens again? What if they find a really bad excuse, to lock people down, and it's a reason that you don't that you disagree with, and you don't want to become a slave of Walmart, of Big Pharma, and of the police. After all, even during this crisis, we saw people swarming to the gun stores, trying to buy up firearms. This is a very good thing. It's very good because it's shown that even faced with a threat such as this virus, that there is a substantial contingent of people in this country who fear the government far more than they fear, even the worst of threats. I can only imagine how much this effect would have been multiplied had Hillary Clinton been president, and people would have been, entirely skeptical of everything that the government was doing. Because, of course, the people who are more likely to, buy guns and be skeptical of government tyranny are going to be, people who would have voted for Trump anyway. But, it helps that Trump himself has portrayed himself as a bit of a skeptic and as an opponent, in many cases, of the state government's actions. So anyway, with that said, if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.